This show is part of the Darkmoor Podcast Network.
To join our community Discord or see more content from our members, visit darkmoorpodcasts.com.
In today's episode, we discuss how to teach clearly, lessons in vehicular combat, and finding true expertise through experience. This is the DM Shower Thoughts. Welcome back. Welcome back, everybody, to DM Shower Thoughts, the podcast where we discuss how to become our best selves through gaming. If you love our content, drop a 5-star review on iTunes and check out our Patreon for exclusive content, behind-the-scenes audio, and early access to episodes and personalized D&D coaching. My name is Adamus.
I'm John.
And I'm Ian.
And today we're going to kick it off with a shower thought, first from John. I think things are going to flow pretty organically from there. Go for it, bud.
Okay. So I was actually in a martial arts class with Ian yesterday, and this whole shower thought kind of formed from something the teacher said, which is that experts in their field, like true experts, right? Not just somebody who's done it for a long time, know their craft so well that they know how to simplify things in order to increase everybody's understanding. That it's one of the ideas that a rising tide lifts all ships, that like a true expert, right, isn't going to try to artificially position themselves as an expert by using fancy language or unnecessarily complex terms, right? They may use a complex term, but the explanation is simplified, right? And I've played in a lot of D&D games, and I've been on both sides of the screen, right? So I've been the DM, I've been a player, and one of the things that I'm always interested in is how DMs approach their teaching methodology, right? Because that's the thing, is that DMs are also teachers, right? Which is part of where our slogan, we find our best selves through gaming, kind of comes from, is the recognition that really a lot of the DMing soft skills are just the same as teaching soft skills. And I don't think it's a coincidence that a lot of really well-known dungeon masters also, have filled the teacher's seat at one point in their lives. Like even Adam, like you're a music teacher, right? And Ian and I have both instructed martial arts before. So there's kind of that educational background to it. But one thing that I did want to call attention to is just using clear, comprehensive language, right? That I've seen usually when you're a DM and you're teaching new players about the game, or you're trying to teach a mechanic that might not come up very often. Either the tendency is to go one of two directions, either overcomplicate or too simple, right? So what I mean by this is that, a DM that may not have as good a grasp on the rules themselves, you can usually tell if they try to overcomplicate the language. They try to use a lot of multi-syllable words that you don't really need, right? And really what that comes with is they're trying to convey the narrative without understanding the tools that are at their disposal. The thing about 5th edition's system that is becoming clearer and clearer every time someone asks me a mechanical question, everything is thought out pretty well. And it's all clearly defined. It's not always easily referenced, though. And that's the thing. Like we talked about in a really early episode, if you have a creature that's incapacitated and they get hit by a melee attack, then they suffer the same as a critical attack, which translates to 2 death failures, right? Those rules are clear, but it's not necessarily easily referenced, right? So one of the things we found was that the incapacitated condition was separated from the death save rules in combat. It was in 2 completely separate sections of the book. So if for whatever reason you have an encyclopedic knowledge of the rules, or your brain just kind of processes that way, you can put 2 to 2 together and understand how it should be ruled if your ruling rules is written, right? And it's my belief that as a DM and a player, you're empowered if you understand the rules as written instead of relinquishing that power to your dungeon master, because first, your dungeon master may not know the rules as written as well as you do, right? Also, as soon as you know the rules as written, you can make an intentioned decision on whether or not you're going to rule something narratively in a balanced way. Because what I find is that DMs that don't really understand the system themselves, that are like, oh, we'll just make it up as we go, we'll do something that makes sense for the narrative, are also the DMs that are likely to have unfun games because of imbalances in their homebrew, right? And that I think is the key thing. I'm not saying you should do rules as written. I'm saying there's a lot of benefit to understanding the rules as written so that you understand the game balance. So if you imbalance something, you're doing so deliberately. You're not going to like accidentally make one character super powerful and make the other 3 players feel like they're not contributing effectively. Make sense so far? So there are some like really easy examples I can draw on, right? Because the opposite is also a problem, where you simplify terms too much in order to try to get someone to understand it, that either you use colloquialisms or you try to use shorthand, something like that, where it doesn't teach the players how to look up rules for themselves, right? So an example of this is the obscured rules. This is something we recently dived into. I realized I wasn't ruling dark vision correctly, right? And it's not necessarily a bad thing. It doesn't mean my games were less fun, but it means now I have an additional little tiny tool that I can use in order to create dynamic choices when it comes to the characters and that my players want to bring to the table. So what I mean by this is it says in the exploration chapter that there are basically 3 stages of light. You have bright light, dim light, and darkness, right? Now, if you're in bright light, everything is normal, right? You don't have any penalties to anything. Any bonus is as it should be, right? Now, dim light, you have disadvantage on perception checks that rely on sight. However, you don't have any disadvantage on anything like attack rolls or saving throws or anything. Just ability checks that rely on sight, right? And then darkness, you effectively suffer the blinded condition, which again, you now have to look up in blinded what that means. You know, attack rolls against you have advantage. Your attack rolls that rely on sight have disadvantage. This is where something like the blind fighting style that's new in Tasha's can really become kind of cool, is because now you have a specific mechanical puzzle piece to your character that can counter that systematic thing. But one of the common complaints about 5th edition is, oh, everybody has dark vision. So I don't feel like I can challenge my players because they never light a torch because they all have dark vision. And the thing about dark vision is it specifically says that you can see in dim light as if it's bright light. You can see in darkness as if it's dim light. Meaning, if everything is completely dark, your dark vision character still has disadvantage on perception checks. That's never something I've ruled, but it's something that's clear in the system. So, however, I can see a DM being like, oh, dim light means, you know, it's harder to see like a little bit, or it's for ambiance, or it's for narrative, or they try to brush off that very relevant rule as something that's kind of narrative because of their lack of understanding. And when that becomes simplified, now your players have one less gameplay choice that they can make. Does that make sense? So for example, like I've had multiple players be like, do we want to light a torch? No, we all have dark vision. Let's just not. And there's no consequence to that. But now you have a choice. Do we create a light source where we don't have disadvantage on perception checks? Also, it makes it easier to get ambushed because now other people can see our light source. Or do we suffer a disadvantage to perception checks, but it's easier for us to stealth? And now you're basically making a game where like, oh, what if there's like another party of goblins that are trying to out-stealth you? So now you're both out trying to out-stealth each other, but you both have disadvantage on your perception checks because neither of you want to use light sources. And remember, Disadvantage on perception checks also means you get a -5 to your passive perception. So even if you have a passive perception character with 17, now their passive perception is only a 12 if they're relying on dark vision without a light source. Now, this is of course negated by something like Devil's Sight, which clearly states that you see in darkness as if it's normal, right? But this is what I'm saying is, a lot of times DMs would accidentally hand wave that very interesting dynamic choice in order to try to get their players to understand it, but masking the fact they don't understand it themselves. And that's why basically the way I wanted to start is, as a DM, when you teach the game or teach a small tool like that, teach it clearly, comprehensively. Don't change the language of the game, because that language is very intentional and it matters, and provide almost like a tutorial. So that way you're not springing it on your players or like, haha, now you have disadvantage. Yes, you shouldn't have known that. It's like present that choice clearly. Oh, you'll have this mechanical choice of this. You'll have this other mechanical choice if you choose this. Which one would you rather choose for this scenario?
This also lends a lot more power to, I've been thinking specifically about my Shadowfell players, and then also about my Dark Owls players. I made a custom race for Dark Owls in the form of the Azer. So the Azer is not a dwarf creature that's made mostly of like bronze metal, and they're all unique. They're built by each other, and they're like all about being themselves and individualized existence, but they have like a flaming face and flaming hair and stuff. And when I built this race as like a playable race, I gave them not superior dark vision, I gave them like sun vision. And the idea being they can see out to 120 feet and it's bright light. Like they can just see in all these places. And what we're starting to see is that I'm trying to give a lot more opportunities where their vision benefits, that it's very clear that they see everything, that they move across a landscape, and because of your vision, you can see very deep into that cave. Here's all the details you can see, where everyone else has to like sneak in, light a torch, look at it up close. He can just go whoop and look, and that should have a lot of power. What I'm finding with Shadowfell, I gave anyone who was like born in the Shadowfell, I gave an extra boon, like they have a little bit of extra abilities, and that those little boons involve like being able to go invisible in the shadows, or manipulate your own shadow, or you get visited by the dreams of other creatures, and you're sort of connected to the dark dreamscape of people. But this whole thing with vision, there's a rogue and a ranger in the party. We've got I forgot what type of rogue he is. Oh no, he's a thief rogue, and a gloomstalker ranger. And they have a lot of hiding mechanics that they actually can play off of each other in really strong ways. But I think back to the very first time that they caused a lockdown situation where everything went dark, all the torches went out, and they went invisible and started sneaking around. We're about to have another scenario probably later today that's similar to that, where they're going to have to probably sneak around, and I'm going to probably present to them the adjustment in vision, because I think it's going to lend a lot more power to their boons, because they grew up in the Shadowfell. They have probably better vision in dim light, and they already have dark vision. So I'm going to be playing it with certain advantages for them, but then their allies will have the same disadvantages that are in the rules. And I wonder if that'll also elevate their own power to scope out and scout ahead for the party, but it will be less cut and dry of we scout ahead because we can see in the dark. And it's more, we have a little more ability and we're really sneaky, but our enemies aren't as sneaky. So we'll have a better time navigating, and then we can, take care of threats. I think it's going to add a good complexity to it.
Yeah, and to kind of just circle that back into like a specific example of this, again, the true expert is all about just being helping somebody else understand something, and usually not overcomplicating it, right? And also not oversimplifying it. So especially since most of everybody's gaming nowadays is virtual, and even if it's not online, everyone pretty much has access to some kind of device with a Wi-Fi connection, right? If you're listening to this podcast, it's that device. you know, it's easier now more than ever to just Google a rule, you know. So and that's the thing I really encourage DMs to get their players in the habit of doing, because now that'll speed up games that could be slowed down otherwise. So for example, the what's it called? The dim light rule references lightly obscured, which is a condition of vision, right? Now, when you have a player and they look up something like fog cloud, and it's like there's an area that's heavily obscured, that doesn't just mean, that's not flavor text, you know? That's mechanics text, which impacts the game state. So rather than just be like, oh, now you have a fog cloud, you have to look up what heavily obscured means. And that way you're training your players to look for the mechanical things that will allow them to clearly make decisions, as opposed to sort of kind of make decisions and then, you know, be surprised at the outcome because it wasn't how they thought it would work, right? And the more you empower your players to make clear decisions, the more trust they're going to have in you as a DM. And that, of course, is the magic thing, right? The more trust you have as a DM, now you can start doing cooler things. And now, when you start implementing homebrew, it's not going to slow down your game. I think I've said this before, but I'll say it again. One of the reasons my latest campaign, which is heavily homebrewed, is working so successfully is because I spent the first 5 years of our gaming training everybody to the rules as written, training them to look for specific mechanics text and to have very clear choices that they look up ahead of time, so that now when I add in a homebrew term or a homebrew system, it's nothing that they can't handle. Because it's not about knowing the rules, it's about having a process of learning rules, right? And then learning those rules over time. So does heavily obscured come up a lot? It might not in your game, right? But in something like Curse of Strahd, where there's an evil mist, you know, that hides dangers in the dark, that might be a super relevant rule. One last example I have of this happened in a game last night when I used the Calm Emotion spell, where Calm Emotions, one of the effects you can do is you can force a certain number of humanoids in an area to make a charisma save, and if they fail, you get to choose an effect. One is to take away Charmed or Frightened, right? Which are conditions that are very clear. Most players know that. But another effect is you can take a creature that is hostile, and you can instead make it indifferent. That is a mechanical condition in 5th edition. It's not just, oh, they're all friends now. It's like, no, you can look up what it means to be a hostile creature. That's why DMs that are like, friends is the most broken cantrip, I heavily disagree with them. Because friends clearly states it's a non-hostile creature you get advantage on, right? Once the spell ends, that creature becomes hostile, meaning you can't friends again, right? And what does hostile mean? There again, hostile means that they're going to try to impede the efforts of the creature they're hostile towards, right? It's like a relationship condition, and as weird as it sounds, these are all narrative terms that can help a DM leverage into better descriptions. They're also mechanics terms. There is a very clear definition of what these different kinds of conditions mean in the context of your game world and your game state, right? So, and that's more what I'm encouraging DMs to do. Don't try to take away from that mechanics text, because that's going to withdraw your players' trust. And again, this isn't like a philosophical argument. These are patterns that I've observed over time. I've seen DMs that try to do this. Their players end up frustrated most of the time, right? The clearer you are with your mechanics, the faster you can get the mechanics out of the way so that you can invest more energy in storytelling, which is why most people are here to here to begin with. If they didn't want storytelling, they'd play Warhammer. They'd play a different kind of war game, you know? So, but anyway, I'm going to kick it over to Ian right now.
Yeah, you brought up hostility and basically the social interaction preface for when you're talking to an NPC that's not actively attacking you, I guess. And there's actually rules for this in the DMG that I personally have been trying to look towards more often. These rules pertain to the difficulty class of getting that NPC to do something in your favor. So there's these three different relationship conditions for NPCs towards the player characters. The first one is friendly, which means that they are, most likely to do something for you out of the three of these. So DC of 0 is that this NPC will offer help without taking risks towards themselves. Very easy to talk to, very easy to get help from, like, for example, a shopkeeper that really likes you. It's pretty easy to negotiate with this person. The DC 10 gives that if you roll a 10, for example, on a persuasion check, the NPC will help even if small risks are involved. And a DC of 20 is the NPC will take big risks for the sake of the PCs. Going on to indifferent, the NPC offers no help but does no harm. And then the DC 10 means that the NPC will help as long as no risks are involved. And DC 20 means that they will help even if small risks are involved. So you can see there's this casual progression of less of an NPC being less and less likely to do something risky for you, basically. And that's why when you get to hostile, it's very different. So if a hostile creature is being negotiated with at a DC of 0, they oppose the PCs, like John said, and they may take risks to do so. Additionally, at DC 10, the NPC offers no help but does no harm. So this is you persuading them to be on your side more. And then at a DC 20, the NPC will help as long as there are no risks involved. So basically, when you're negotiating with these creatures, you have to roll persuasion and meet certain DCs to get them to act in your interest. This is also something, like John was saying, this is a mechanics thing that we as DMs can show the players and teach the players about through the social interactions that they have. Of course, this requires that the players are like, I want to get something from this character, or I want to persuade them to stop doing something. I want to intimidate them to stop doing something. All these social interaction skill checks come into play when you consider whether or not they are friendly, indifferent, or hostile. And it's very important to understand those depending on the environment that you're in. If you're in a town versus if you're in a fortress versus if you're in a cave somewhere and there's a hermit or something like that. And yeah, so I just thought I would bring that up. There was another another scenario of the raw that I've been learning a lot more about lately that is similar to the dark vision bit, which is that invisibility isn't just a get out of jail free card that I thought it was. I know some DMs out there who are just like, invisibility, they're invisible, you can't see them, you can't find them, and you're in the middle of combat. If this happens in the middle of combat, then you're definitely not going to find them because there's a lot of things going around. So for me, I was wondering, okay, is that really how invisibility works in the raw? Because that seems honestly, it seems kind of broken. So I looked it up, and there's actually a lot of rules that go into invisibility. Now, you as the DM have the choice of whether or not you want to hand wave these, but like we've been saying, understanding the raw allows you to make decisions and adjustments in the game that make it more fun for your players. And if things are too clunky, knowing the raw will balance out your homebrew rulings. So the thing with invisibility is that, first of all, you are considered heavily obscured, as if you were in total darkness. So that means that your attacks have advantage against, the defender, and attackers against you have disadvantage if they know where you are. So like, that's why there's this grids when you're in combat, is they're in that space, you can swing at that space, but you have disadvantage. The other thing is that because they're heavily obscured, they don't provoke opportunity attacks when they walk away. So if I cast Invisibility and I'm right next to you and you're going to swing at me on your next turn and I know that, then I cast Invisibility and I can just kind of out of there, just like with Darkness for Warlocks. And so that's important. But it's not just about invisibility, because if your character casts invisibility and doesn't take the hide action, then they are not considered hidden, which means that the enemy knows that your character is invisible and moved 5 feet away from that character. Basically, they may have disadvantage and all that stuff to hit them, but they know, generally speaking, what direction they went. So that's why it's interesting then, because it's not just I'm invisible and I walk away and they'll never find me ever again. It's I'm invisible, but if I don't take the hide action, they can just perceive where I am, basically, even if they can't see me as a whole. And that's because in the wording of the spell, as far as I remember it, an invisible creature leaves behind tracks such as footsteps, sounds that they make, things like that. All those things are still there. So even in the middle of combat, based on the raw, even in the middle of combat, you can basically just follow an invisible creature around and try to take swings at them until they take the hide action, in which case it is a contested stealth versus perception check. So the invisible creature, when they take the hide action, they don't get like advantage or anything like that, but they can just hide anywhere. That's the benefit of it. It's not like with Rogue, where you just burrow into the dirt, I guess, because there's no bushes around or something like that. You can literally just hide anywhere. So you hide and you roll your stealth check. Then when it's the attacker's turn, or the seeker in this case, the seeker makes their perception check and they have to beat the DC of your stealth check. But if you roll a low stealth check, then they'll still find you. So it makes it much more dynamic in that sense. But the reason that this is so complicated is because, like I said, otherwise it would be broken. But also the reason a lot of DMs hand wave this is because it's so complicated. It's the same thing with dark vision. There are so many references going around. You need to know what heavily obscured means. You need to know what provokes opportunity attack or does not provoke opportunity attack. You need to know what the hide action does. So all of these things need to be in the DM's head, because they need to be able to tell the players and introduce them to this mechanic in an efficient way where they learn, basically. And that's another thing, is that this kind of reminds me of not just of tutorial levels in video games, but also of just like those good video games where they introduce one thing at a time to you that is new, and you die because you don't know anything about it. It's like Dark Souls, you go and find the next boss and they have a whole new mechanic that you've never seen before, and you die a million times until you finally figure it out. Oh, I have to tumble when they start charging up their power attack, that kind of thing. So I think it's interesting to take a look at the mechanics this way, and take a look at how we're teaching the players at our table this way, because the way D&D is set up, it is elegant and the rules are balanced, generally speaking, and they refer to each other in a balanced way. It's just that you need to kind of know what all the rules are so you can put the whole puzzle together in general.
Yeah, definitely. And one thing I want to be clear with is that you're not expected to be perfect, like you're gonna make mistakes. I just said I've been ruling dark vision wrong for years and years now. And this whole vision dim light thing was really, it highlighted again to me that most of the time, like I want to say like 95% of the time, there is a rule for it. It's just, again, how easy it is to reference. And if you're focused on the physical book and that's your only thing that you're willing to reference, it's going to take time to flip through and find that stuff. But again, if you've got a Google Chrome tab open and you can just Google heavily obscured 5e, now that referential resistance is reduced, so that way you can incorporate a lot more of these mechanics. And one thing that we've been talking about it more and more, and this is one of those like, duh, I wish I knew this when I started, is that in all honesty, a lot of times when we make circumstantial rulings to conserve time, that has an exponential cost later on, where we may solve it in the moment, right? But that's like putting duct tape on a leak, like a bad leak, and the leak is our understanding. So later on, when there's a player that's actually done the work to look it up and contests us, it's like, oh no. And then everyone gets confused. Well, what is the actual ruling? And then there are some players that get stuck in the original way it was ruled. And now you're ruling it a different way. And you're doing rules as written versus rules as intended. And then you end up in an argument later on. Whereas, if a player is like, I cast Fog Cloud, and you're like, what does it do? And they're like, oh, it heavily obscures an area. So you look up what heavily obscures means. It takes time now, but it saves exponential time later on because your players are learning it more and more. And that's the thing, is that for both players and DMs, the only way to learn a system is through experience, right? And that experience takes time. So really, I think the root issue ends up being impatience. And a lot of times we can convince ourselves, oh, it's momentum. Oh, there's a flow. When it's like, no, we're just being impatient. We're being hasty, And really, I think that a lot of the time, think about how much more valuable it would be to also introduce that element to your table, that we're willing to take our time to kind of get it right. And Ian, like you said, a lot of this is complicated at first because it's new, like you have to reference darkness, which then references heavily obscured, which then references the blinded condition, which then, do I have advantage? Do I have disadvantage? Do I make a perception check? How does disadvantage impact passive perception? That's a lot of rules in a lot of different places. And the more practice you get at it, the faster and faster those connections will be made. And you just end up ruling it easier and easier each time. That's the other mark of a true expert, is that they make something difficult look easy, right? And to speak to the martial arts, our martial arts school has a pretty structured curriculum where it's like, you are this belt, meaning you learn this stuff. Then when you're the next belt, you learn this stuff, And at one point, each of the main instructors, they just kind of know, oh, you're that belt, you're learning that, And people are like, oh, there's so much stuff. How do you remember it all? It's like, well, when you do it for 10 years professionally, 40 hours a week, you start to remember a thing or two. And it's just experience. It's not, I didn't have a special trick. I didn't have a mnemonic device. It's just, you do it enough and you just start remembering, So it's not about, like, if a DM or a player, it seems like they have an encyclopedic knowledge of the rules, it really means that they've just done more work to get there. There's nothing special about it. They've just read it more. They've played it more. They've run scenarios through their head. They've just put more work in, And it doesn't mean, or I should say, they've put a sufficient amount of, or more sufficient amount of work in. Because there are some people that tend to have a better memory than others. There is kind of like that unique individual component. Some people can, in the martial arts, learn a technique faster than others. But again, they've just put in the sufficient amount of work that it looks easy, right? And the one last thing I want to wrap up this shower thought with before I turn it over to Adam for his collection there is one of the things that I've been telling myself as a mantra for the past 2 weeks or so is own your mistakes so that your mistakes don't own you. Because anytime we try to hide from our mistakes, just like if we don't take our time to learn a rule, it's going to have an exponential cost later on, right? Whereas if we pay a small amount up front, now that saves us a lot in the long run. Personal tangential example, my chimney's falling apart. It's going to be a lot of money, but it's going to be even more money if I ignore it and my chimney collapses in on itself in the middle of winter and I need to have emergency services build me a new one real quick, So it's a little bit, and it might even feel like a hefty investment now, exponential payoff later on. So again, own your mistakes so your mistakes don't own you.
Games are fun to play. Whether it's chess, Mario Kart, or Dungeons & Dragons, we've all sat down to play a game with our friends before. But what is it that keeps us coming back to our favorites? How do developers craft the experiences that keep us this engaged? I'm Sully, host of the podcast Fun But Why. Join us as we talk to game industry professionals and break down the levels, mechanics, and design of their favorite gaming experiences. Fun But Why releases new episodes every Tuesday, wherever you get your podcasts.
So one of the things we've started to address here has to do with, the power of pre-framing and teaching your players either before you introduce something or right as you introduce it, or introduce elements slowly over time. And in a lot of ways, in my experience now, I've been doing a lot more of recalibrating and trying new things. Now, with those new things, of course, come new lessons. And also, as I've started to mentor a few more people, recognizing as a player in their games, what is it that kind of irks me about something that they're doing, and recognizing, is that me? Am I assuming something, or is it there like a communication issue that I'm having? And I'll usually try and check myself. Not get angry about something, just check myself and write down what it was and think about it later. And this brought up some interesting ideas. And we often use assumptions, or at least in society, we use assumptions kind of in a negative light, that you don't want to assume too much about everything because it gets you in trouble. But I wonder if instead of an assumption, there's a certain expectation, like a generalized rule in your head that you should just put into practice, so that your players have a better time, and that you have a better time, and everybody builds trust and rapport, especially empathy. And I was pondering about these, and I realized that in the beginnings of my DMing experience, did these things. And now I recognize why and like what it came from. It came from experience with Pathfinder. Not to keep throwing Pathfinder under the bus, but Pathfinder has a strong structure of heavy rules, heavy interpretations of those rules, very specific, everything, highly customizable, but so big, so involved. And every single game of Pathfinder I've ever played in has had a discussion of how a certain rule resolves, and play always grinds to a halt. I played Pathfinder for 8 years. Every single session had at least one moment where everything grinds to a halt, and we go, well, it says here in this rule, at this subtext, at this time, that this is how it's done. And we almost have a little mini argument of how the rules are interpreted. That also bred a practice in me and in players that surrounded me to always be ready to defend themselves and justify their rules, justify their play. And it was always a me versus the DM, or the DM versus the players sort of mentality, where you're always trying to find the truth of how this should be interpreted. And it's all justified by the raw. Coming from that to 5th edition, there are these little things at the table that I recognize I used to do and that I've been letting go of. One of these is, and I'm going to say it as frame it as an assumption, and I think it's a good thing to assume. The assumption is that information in a campaign can be difficult to remember, especially if you are playing infrequently. Players will probably forget things. They might take excellent notes. You might have a living document that helps them. We might have a lot of different resources, but they can still forget things. Or so go, wait, what was the name of that guy again? Because I'll do it too. I'll go, wait, oh no, what was the name of that warlord that we saw 5 months ago? Oh no, well, they're coming back to that city, so I'm sure they're going to see him again. What was his name? Oh man, player knowledge wanes. And in the beginnings, I would unconsciously punish players for forgetting things. And it never feels good. Like, it's never a good thing. And what it does is it also it hurts the player and DM relationship. It's like, oh, you should have remembered that. Why? How does that actually help the game state if you are forced to remember all these other things with all the other things in our lives too? How cool is it if together we go, oh yeah, about 5 sessions ago, we met this warlord. Remember that guy? He had like the sideburns. He had this weird beard. He talked kind of like this. And they go, oh yeah, that guy. Oh my gosh, is that guy? Yeah, that's that guy. Do you guys remember anything else about him? Oh yeah, didn't this happen? Yeah, that happened. I think this also happened too. Can anyone confirm that for me? And you have this little conversation about like reminding each other what that was. And this assumption that they're probably going to forget things because so are you. How about we help each other remember them? That's an assumption of a collective experience. That also teaches the players that I'm not going to hurt you because you didn't remember a key detail months ago. Why would I do that to you? And unfortunately, in the very beginnings, I was unconsciously doing that. It's a recognition now that, holy moly, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for that to happen. And I think it stemmed from that constant need to always be on my game and always have everything, all the answers ready to go at all times. So assume that your players are probably going to forget things and then support them when they do. That's the big kicker. Assume they'll forget things, support them when they do, and help build them back up to that moment. Give them the proper recap. It's okay to stop the game, to be like, okay, anybody remember who this is? We've seen them before, but it's okay if you forgot. Let's figure it out. And like the characters would know. So help the players remember. That's huge. And that also means assume that in the cinematic world, that the characters don't blue screen. That if they see someone that they are supposed to recognize, like from their backstory or whatnot, and the player's having an off day, the character, like if the player goes, and stares off into the distance with deer in headlights moment, their character, Grignar, the dragonborn warrior priest, doesn't suddenly go, they're not blue screening, the player is. So time pauses, and then you help them figure it out and bring them forward. But I've been at tables where if the player hesitates, the character hesitates too, and then the DM punishes them. And that's a very different table. Now, there are people that are going to say like, oh, well, but I want to be in the moment. I'm acting in the moment and all that. You can still have that. But if you have an off day and you have like, oh no, who was that guy? Oh man, I forgot all about that guy. That's you. I sometimes will say now when I'm playing that this is an Adam problem. Adam forgot that. Adam messed that up. Can we go back? Because my character would know that. I forgot. Is that okay if we go back? Or is that okay? You know what? I don't think I say that because Adam made that mistake. And that's the player going, oops, can my character not die because Adam went oopsie and forgot a thing? Is that all right? And that if a player even comes to you with that, I would say yes, if it makes sense to do so, if you agree with that point of logic that, their character would know that, so they wouldn't make that decision. Can we go back? Yeah, let's go back. And if you're able to honor that, and I wouldn't say always do it, if it doesn't make sense, then like talk through it, but listen to that player and show them the path. If they can't go back, explain why. And if they can go back, also explain why, and try to build that that wonderful bit of trust and empathy, because we need to empathize with our players. We're all human beings, and we all make mistakes, and we all forget stuff. The idea is, if this is about relationships, because really it is, we have to slowly put away and let die the relationship of the DM versus the players, of this adversarial relationship of I'm right, you're wrong, shut up because I'm the DM, and it's because I say so, and you better get over it. There are certain tables that are run that way. In my experience, tables that if I run a table that way, it's not going to be a positive experience for my players, and those are the campaigns that die. Whereas so much better for us to enter into a cooperative state. So I assume that my characters won't blue screen. The players might, the characters don't. Time stops in that moment. It's okay to retcon something if there was a miscommunication. Clarify, go, oh, he's not being aggressive. I'm sorry. I go, you know what? I don't punch him in the face. I thought he was being aggressive. Even if you're like, guys, I said he wasn't being aggressive. I know I assumed that he was being aggressive. I don't punch him in the face. Sorry about that. Even if you were as clear as possible, if there's still a clear miscommunication, it's okay to step outside of the game and clarify that understanding. Be like, you guys are really aggressive toward him. What's up? What's going on? And they can use that. They can tell you what's going on, because you might have explained it or thought you were clear, but a player is a human being and they might jump onto a different conclusion. In the past, I think I would have waited too long if they had gone down that logic train and gone down this huge, many terrible decisions that have now ruined a relationship with an NPC. Whereas I could have stopped them at the second one and said, what's your intention here? What do you want? What are you trying to do? What do you think is going on? And that is a great way to kind of check everybody. And how much more of a fun and immersive experience is it if we're all moving forward with the same measure of understanding? It is not my job to punish someone for misunderstanding something. That is bogus. That's not my job as a teacher. So assume they'll forget things, help them. Assume assume that that clarifying is going to be necessary, and that we're all here to play together. And assume that your relationship is something. I'm spiraling into philosophical anger as I stare deeply into the non-existent whiskey glass ahead of me and think deeply about the horrible pasts of my past tables that I've run, the many dungeon masters that I've wanted to punch in the face and defenestrate.
How many
Yes.
lives have I ruined?
How many lives have I ruined from my rules mastering? How dare I? So many times that players have made horrible jokes next to each other, and I've said, you say that in the tavern? You're thrown out of the tavern. How dare you attempt to have humor at the table when you're in character, you silly, silly boy. Make jokes at the table. They're not necessarily in character. Don't punish your players for having fun. Okay.
One of the this really is kind of the theme of this episode, is how to establish trust, right? Because when you establish trust, you can like gift your table with your creative contribution, right? Because really that's what you're doing. You're never interrupting, you're contributing to the story. A lot of times I feel like to go off of what Adam said about your players' intentions and being clear, there's a lot of times in the service of building trust, not every time, but a good amount of the time, like my players will want to do something like punch the guard, punch the NPC. And if we're all clear and on the same page, I'm not going to try to one up them, and that's part of letting my players feel powerful, like they can affect the story. So it's not they go to punch the guard and I'm like, I catch your fist, and then the guard beats you down even though you're a 9th level adventurer because all my guards are 15th level. So it's like it's a lot of times respecting my players' intentions. I mean, I did this with an entire story for Geras. There was an interaction that I talked about on the podcast that I bungled, and I accidentally misrepresented an NPC I made. So when I retold it, I kept the players' actions the same because the player said they were comfortable reacting like that. I made the NPC a lot more insidious because of it. So I took it upon myself as the storyteller and dungeon master. My NPC is secondary to the PCs. So if I need to change my NPC to make the PC's actions make sense and make them come off in a better light, then I'm going to do that. And now my players are going to trust the fact that I'm going to respect their storytelling choices, right? Because a lot of times DMs will be like, well, that's not how this character works, And I'll do that occasionally, especially for Geras right now, we're kind of all coming up on a bunch of really big bad bosses. So for those very keystone anchory characters, maybe they have some unfair powers. But in general, even if it's a pretty high level NPC, I'll just let them get punched. I won't even have an armor class. I'll just be like, oh, you punch them? Okay, they get punched. Don't even roll damage. You punched them. What do you want to do with them next? So that way it's respecting the character's autonomy and the player's storytelling choices. Another thing Adam mentioned was on memory and just players remembering things. Remember, players will remember it anyway through experience. If they meet the same warlord named Bob enough times, eventually they'll remember the name is Bob. So rather, like you said, Adam, instead of punishing them for whatever reason, even punishment can be something as little as a chastisement, like, wow, you guys didn't remember it. That's a punishment, right? They're embarrassed for not remembering. Whereas if you have that conversation every time you meet the warlord Bob, the players eventually will realize it's more effort to not remember the name than to just remember it. So they'll actually be encouraged to remember it more, and that's why you'll get more immersion, because they'll be instead of taking the time to try to remember every time we talk to this guy what we did with them, now you're just you're speeding past that part. It's oh yeah, Bob, yeah, and then you can remember the more complicated names like Ryphen and Xanthopus. I don't know, whatever you want you want to call them. So
I love that Ryphen actually is a character that you guys met in that Thursday campaign.
Yeah,
good job.
Thank you. I remembered it because I didn't want to have to keep asking who this guy is again. So one of the things you brought up, Adam, and this is just my last 2 little bullet points before I kick it off, is the fastest way I found to grow as a DM is to play as a player in one of your players' games that they're DMing, and not just any other game. Not just oh, you're just joining a Roll20 game randomly. It's you're a DM and you have 4 friends that you're DMing for, right? Specifically have them fill in the DM seat, right? Not only will you empathize what it's like being on the other side of the screen, so that, like you said, Adam, that's all empathy, right? I forget things too as a player. So as a DM, I should DM as if my players are going to forget things, because I know what that feels like, and it'll really be a strong reflection of your strengths and weaknesses at the table, right? Because if your players do, it's so much, usually I find, and again, this is one thing I want to give Adam a lot of credit for. I've heard players talk about adversarial DMing in a positive light because they like that competitive feel. This is no judgment on anybody doing that, right? We have observed with our games and 5 years of doing this professionally, this is the cause and effect of adversarial DMing in this way, right? So this isn't a judgment. This is a report, you know, and it's a lot harder to argue with a report. So, but anyway, when you have a DM and they start doing something and then they're like, well, you did that in my game. Now you can honestly reflect and be like, you're quicker to recognize it in someone else a lot of times than it is for yourself. So if you see somebody else, the opposite can also be true though, where it's like, whoa, that was a really cool way you structured that battle. And it was like, well, yeah, I learned it from you. I stole it from you. Like Geras, as much as I'll talk up how awesome Geras is, the reason why the structure is so successful is because I learned the one-shot model from Adam. I stole it, and I, as well as even the equipment progression was from Night Owls. I just changed it based on seeing the gaps in 5th edition system, right? And the chat thing that I always harp on, I learned from Ian's game, right? I didn't come up with any of this. It was more just, I feel like the people who discovered that DNA was a double helix, or it's like, I did no original research. All I did was steal from everybody else, you know? Double helix! So, but, you know, a lot of times now, and when a DM tries something unique that you had never thought of before, you know, I played in a game last night with a pretty novice DM, but their exploration was actually really engaging, and it's because they used a technique of using a random table, and I'm like, duh, random table. Like, all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, that's what makes exploration interesting. So, like, all of a sudden that revolutionized how I look at that pillar of play. It doesn't take a genius or a master DM and I'm the apprentice to learn stuff, right? A lot of times you can learn from yourself through it being reflected in somebody else. So, which is why I think it's so awesome, Adam, that, you know, you're looking at like your apprentice people and playing in their games, because now if they do something, you're like, I recognize me doing that, you know, like now it's a lot easier for you to address it and take action on it, right? Or the opposite, which is, oh, this is really fun, and it's because they learned it from me. Pretty cool. The one example I can think of is Legendary Resistances. You know, I remember the first time, like, we were at D&D Live, and you were like, I do this spell, and I'm like, it uses a legendary resistance. How does that feel? Like, it's like, now we know that legendary resistances suck. So, and they're a stupid mechanic that could be a good mechanic if you change them a little bit.
One, this is a very quick aside. I really like the energy of this discussion. This is fantastic. So I want to make sure I'm clear that the two other apprentices I'm working with now, the one whose game I played in recently, where I started to like check those things in myself, they are doing a tremendous job. And this person knows who they are, so they're doing amazing. And it's amazing because their exploration, like the world that they have made is a homebrew setting. They're not using any modules. And what they've built is something where it feels immediately like a living and breathing world. There is no like NPC archetypes. There's no one that's like typecast. It's just everyone is a person. And those relationships are extremely important. So this is a very, very much rewarding, explorative, and social game setting. And they're really doing a good job of building believable characters and believable interactions. The things that that I'm giving like advice on are all the tiny like micro moments of like, oh, this little transition here or this there, but it's always going to be coming from, and what I had to learn when it came to mentorship is never come at it from a point of criticism from me. I want to ask the DM, how do you think it went? Because if the DM is uncomfortable, I think you're not going to have a very good game. If they're having a really hard time moving through navigating themselves, then that's going to be super hard. But that's a point of learning for myself. Is I think in the beginnings of all of that, of trying to step into a mentorship role, I would come at it from I saw this and here's how you can fix it. When really my perspective has value, but it's not, I think, the most valuable. The perspective of the DM in those moments be reflective and to be observant of those things that were little hangups, or, oh, you know what, this felt weird to me, and write that down. And then we talk about it and we figure out a solution to move forward. That's more important than me going, I saw you rule this in this way, and it was this way instead. And I, that's way different than like, I caught you, instead of how do we make your experience more smooth so that your play is better. It's just overall better. And it's a lot easier to own that just for myself, to look at it and say, you know what, that also feels better. I think there's a certain color to going through someone's, like a checklist, going through everything and saying, well, you did this right, you did this wrong, you did this right, you did this wrong. That never makes me feel good. It's like pins and needles in my soul. It's terrible. But if I lead with, how did that go for you? I thought this went really well. I really enjoyed this. What did you think about that scene? Did you find any like hiccups in the flow of the game? Anything that felt strange to you? Okay, let's talk about it. And that is an invitation instead of a punitive checklist. And that's also has been a major shift in my growth, is coming at it from, well, what matters? Let's address what matters. What matters, the DM's perspective. In this coaching area, that's what matters. Great. I'm not here to catch them on doing things wrong, quote unquote wrong, like a scolding. It's about them. It's about their growth. So let's see how they are. Because every DM I've worked with has so many more strengths than weaknesses right now. They have so many things that we're leaning hard into those strengths, and they are really, really bringing them to the table. So why would I want to tear them down? I'd much rather raise them up. And that has been a major shift probably in the last year of doing this online. What this all starts to bring up is, if they're going to try new things, and I'm going to try and help them with those new things, even if it's brand new for me, I got to look up new things and go, oh, no, I got to think about that. I'm not sure yet. I tried a new thing last night in Dark Owls, and that was vehicular combat. Dark Owls, quick recap, Dark Owls is in hell. It's in the 9 hells. We're in Avernus, with a floating city above Avernus. And they went down to Avernus into the salt fields. And Avernus, for those of you that have ever heard of Descent into Avernus, it's a Baldur's Gate module for 5th edition. It has sort of a Mad Max feel. You have infernal war machines that are powered by soul coins that have like certain properties, and it's pretty crazy. We introduced vehicular combat. Vehicular combat has some interesting things that are in it, and I learned some lessons. And at the end of the session, instead of just ending the session and then thinking about it, I had a discussion with the players on what I felt went good and what I felt was confusing and difficult, and got their feedback immediately. And that's another point of learning for me, is letting the players know, I didn't think that went very well at this part. This is what I think I'll do in the future. What do you think about that? Because then it's still a collective experience. And what it was we changed the scale of the map because the vehicles move at 100 feet or 200 feet around. So they zoom because they're vehicles. And your characters run at average 30 feet around, maybe 60 if they dash. Already that scale is insane. It means if you're on the vehicle, everything is fast. If you're off the vehicle, you are out of luck. The vehicles will zoom past you, you're out of the chase. Now, there might be opportunities for you to jump onto other vehicles, but those have to move quickly, and you got to make those decisions. On the map, I changed the scale of the map, and it automatically, even though the scale could be interpreted, it confused me, it confused the players, and it slowed down play. Had I just increased the size of the map and kept all the scales the same, we could have followed it in chunks through the map. Okay, now you're all here and this is moving up the map. And they can scroll up the map to see what's ahead of them, but then we're only taking it in those short spots, and things move at the appropriate space. Then spells make sense, range makes sense. Everything is, the squares are the squares. It's always a 5-foot square, and we don't freak out about it. That miscalculation made things really slow for me. Now, it was meant to communicate that speed is exhilarating, that when you're on the vehicles move quickly, and that's really cool. So a lot of things change every round. But falling off the vehicle sucks. Because if you miss your chance to grab onto something else, you're essentially out of this chase. And that is a complete momentum grinding halt for a lot of people. And you're not high enough level to like dimension door onto a thing yet. So the intention was that they were all supposed to stay on the vehicle, but then something happened. A decision was made by a player, which is a variable, and the vehicle rolled, and that threw some characters off. Now we have a weird opportunity to jump on, and if they miss that opportunity, things change. And we reflected on that specific scene, and I talked about, there's a pro and a con to the speed of a vehicle, but if you're ever off that vehicle, that whole dynamic changes. It's like flipping a switch. So we brainstormed a couple things on, like, this is not the first time we'll have vehicles in Dark Owls. So now that we've experienced the first iterants of them, I'll make some adjustments, and I'll talk to you about them before the next session. And we'll try those out too, and we'll learn together how to make this work for all of us. But man, the proficiency part is vehicle proficiencies come into play, soul coins come into play. You can use different totally new mechanics to empower these war machines, and they all move at like 120 feet around. They have damage thresholds and mishaps. It also makes it so you're spending so much time on the vehicle that you're not a character anymore. You're just a person. You're a crew on the vehicle. Whereas that means all their features, all their levels, all of their abilities kind of go out the window because they're just driving the vehicle. And does that remove fun? Because now they're not using those features?
Yeah. All right. I also have tried vehicles, the same rules that you've played. And that definitely ran through my head. The same session, actually, that I had just talked about, where I had bungled an encounter with an NPC, ended with a drag race using infernal war machines. And with the whole speed thing, I think it's interesting because you want to make the vehicle worth it. You want to make the vehicle be able to go faster than people. Because if you think about it, if I'm a person fighting a car, the car is probably going to win. So, and if you think about a chase, I can't on foot chase down a car. Like, that doesn't make any sense. So, but I do think that in terms of the driver, and this is something that, spoiler alert, one of the things we're thinking about restarting is Cloud Singer, and Cloud Singer is all about vehicle proficiencies, really, because of the airships. The character I felt most bad for was the driver, because there's not dynamic choices that you get to make with different risks and reward. It's roll a check to see if you keep it upright. Take the 2 actions you're allowed to use. And that's one of the things I've been thinking about as well. Now, in Cloud Singer originally, when we had streamed it years ago, one of the things that we could do is you could, the ship captain was allowed to steer the ship. She was also, allowed to cast spells and stuff as well. So it's one of those things where I wonder how to make that role more dynamic. I had also tried to introduce vehicular combat in a pretty specific environment. So there wasn't a lot of combat, and there were kind of, I didn't realize how reduced the options I had made were, right? I had a lot of reduced options, which made the combat kind of eh. It was an excellent storytelling segment. So looking back on the narrative, it's like super exciting. You guys are like drifting around the corner, and there's a part where Adam's character Fennec, he gets blasted into a wall while it's going 100 feet per 6 seconds, and his back is like grinding against the wall, and he's getting hurt. And storytelling, it was exhilarating. But I do ask the same question about gameplay. Were the options engaging? And did it feel like you were making a lot of fun decisions? Or was it just, this is the option, I roll, I missed, next turn? Like, which made it like really kind of stale almost. So, and it's just, I think it really depends on the group. I think if you have a story-minded group that, because we know players like that, where they get so invested in the imaginary cinema of what's going on. The gameplay honestly doesn't matter to them. But we do have other players. Like for me, I was thinking if I were a player in this, I'd probably be bored out of my mind. And also a lot of the body language that I was picking up was, we're on to the next thing. Like, when will the next thing happen? And it was like, it kind of like neutralized the feel I wanted, which was exciting drift racing to Initial D music. So it is something I'm really interested in what your fixes might be, or what fixes we come up with, because I do think vehicles are really cool. I don't think I've done them right yet. But again, maybe it just takes experiences to learn the system.
This is the whole capstone of all of this. Experience. And experience creates mastery. And I think that mastery does not mean that you have nothing more to learn. Mastery, if anything, opens the door to much more learning. It opens the door to comfort with learning. It's a process, not a state. And when we talk about mastery, I am a dungeon master. I think I have quite a lot of experience now. And yet I want to try new things so I become more, that I have more skills, that I can have mastery of more skills. And that will, all of these things inform my total game experience, as well as my total life experience. Yay. Hey, new learning. Huzzah. It's good to be comfortable with new learning. And I think also one of the last things, I want to make sure I address that first part though. The other changes, if they're going to stay on the vehicle, we're upgrading this vehicle. The vehicle will now have tethers. So there are stations on top of the vehicle, so you can still cast spells and do other things, but you're connected to a harness that your allies can now reel you back in if you fall off. And it allows you to like jump to another vehicle, be confident that you're not going to get flung off, and then deal with some damage to their driver or something, and then get yanked back. We want to be able to launch over so you can use all your cool battle features and still stay on the vehicle. So you can gain the best of both worlds. And then the other one, I think the solution for Cloudsinger was that I had a special armor window lens around the Daystar that you could cast spells out of. So you could like touch the window and cast an Eldritch Blast through one of the windows and fire off like a cannon. So that way you could still use your spells. We did it with a fireball and like a ray of sickening and ray of sickness and stuff. We've done it so that way all your spells don't become inconsequential when you're in a vehicle. And I think it's really important that your characters have access to at least most of their abilities, and those abilities have value and use, even if you're in a vehicle. And if they don't, that the vehicle segment is a short segment. It's a short narrative, boom, 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 so that it isn't in initiative counts, like crazy slow initiative count. It's magic. Screw physics.
You're gonna get pulled apart, okay? Like, like just imagining. I'm sorry, you can cut this part out, but like,
It's great.
just you're gonna get pulled apart. Just if you think about it, if you're on a high-speed vehicle standing on top of it, and you're attached to this vehicle by a tether, and then let's say this tether has like a crane mechanism, so you can just get reeled back in, just like a fish on a fishing rod, right? Okay, fine, whatever. But if you take a turn on this vehicle, like if the vehicle turns and you're on another vehicle, you're going to immediately experience a lot of g-forces because you are essentially, as we all know, when you turn, you are accelerating. So there's going to be a lot of g-forces suddenly applied to a very small section of your body. Like even with this harness thing, you're like going on a circle, you're going to be following the tangent of the circle, and if that string snaps or if something happens, you are going to rocket straight in the direction of that tangent and probably hit something. But even if the string doesn't snap, if the harness is at an area around your waist or something, you're probably gonna like lose. Yeah, you might get bisected because of the way the harness is positioned. And I don't know. Like, there's probably more to it, but it's
wanna
just
know
really
my
funny to
fix?
me.
My fix is 3D gear from Attack on Titan. That as part of the harness, you have like little jets, magic jets, so that when you start going off course, it's like a little fart bubble. You just go back right back to where you need to go, and then you don't need the fishing line effect. You can just all the way back.
And what I like so much about, especially the vehicular combat that is presented in Avernus, this is an opportunity, but there's a great sense of chaos that is sort of presented as mechanical, both mechanical machines and mechanical game states that is presented. So, like if you suffer damage on the machine and it moves past its damage threshold and it moves past a certain threshold where a mishap happens, the idea being that these infernal war machines are not perfect machines. They're cobbled together bits of scrap metal powered by the dead souls of people trapped in soul coins that are then burned as fuel. It's terrible. And all of that power creates propulsion as well as excess energy. So there are mishaps, things go wrong. If we present this idea of a tether system, or like I could see like a launching trampoline mechanism on the top, so you get kind of launched forward. That's really fun and silly. You could even add a little jetpack that's powered by a soul coin that has to be maneuvered. But all of these things are meant to be experimental technology. So all of them could be prone for error. You strap a jetpack to your back, maybe when you land, you roll a 1 and it explodes. Or maybe your tether breaks. Or maybe the trampoline function malfunctions and you can't launch. You have to like just run and try and jump off. By adding this and saying right at the beginning, these things are not perfect machines. They are weird, devilish constructions that may break and may act strangely because you are literally dealing with forces that you barely understand. And isn't that crazy and fun? And if you pre-frame that, you're going to have a lot more of a craziness going on. Like a really, you're going to buy into that variability. You still try to stack the odds in your favor, but it's going to change. And that discomfort for me from the rule set is also really exhilarating. Whereas before, I think in a different state of mind, a different state of my life, that would be terrifying. That would be too much. I can't do that. When everything else is easier and everything else has reached a point of comfort, I am more comfortable being uncomfortable. And I want to experience that sort of discomfort so that we can add a whole new dimension to our play. Thank you very much, everybody, for tuning in to today's episode of DM Shower Thoughts. You can follow us on iTunes and Spotify, where this podcast uploads every Friday at noon, and check out our Patreon at patreon.com/DM Shower Thoughts. Be sure to hang out with us on the Darkmoor Podcast community Discord by heading over to darkmoorpodcast.com and our Facebook at DM Shower Thoughts Community. Have a wonderful day, everyone, and please, game responsibly. Bye-bye now.